Good morning. I'm Ellen Sigal, Chair and Founder of Friends of Cancer Research. Welcome to today's Friends of Cancer Research virtual meeting, 21st Century Cures listening session, harnessing the power of collaboration. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the signing of the National Cancer Act, the 25th anniversary of the Friends of Cancer Research, and the 5th anniversary of the signing of the 21st Century Cures Act. This important law has already positively impacted the lives of millions of patients impacted by so many illnesses and disease. The law also created the Biden Moonshot, innovative research projects at the NCI and FDA. It also established the Office of Oncology Excellence at FDA. All I can say, it was a good beginning, and we have more work to do. As Congress builds on these achievements, we're excited to hear today from leaders on how to build on this extraordinary progress. I'm pleased to be able to introduce some of our speakers for today's meeting. They are all heroes for patients, innovation, science, and have changed the landscape of cancer and all dreaded diseases. Their tireless efforts have profoundly changed the way we look at science and how important it is to translate the science for patients. First, our Congresswoman Diana DeGette and Congressman Fred Upton, both dear friends and heroes and authors of the Cures 2.0 discussion draft. And joining them are amazing champions and leaders, Richard Pazdur, Director of the OCE at the FDA, and Dr. Ned Sharpless, Director of the NCI. We owe you a debt of gratitude, and my message is clear. Continue to advocate for patients and science. We still have a great deal of work to do. I now will turn it over to Representative DeGette and Upton. Thank you for your tireless work.
Welcome, everybody. And I want to thank Ellen and Friends of Cancer Research for inviting us to join this special event. And I also want to thank our fellow panelists, Dr. Pazdur and Sharpless, for joining us. And of course, my compadre and friend, Fred Upton, for being with us all this whole time. As everybody knows, in 2015, Fred and I came together to develop bipartisan legislation that would help modernize how we do our biomedical research in this country, and then how we can expedite new cures and treatments for some of the world's most difficult diseases. And that led to the passage of 21st Century Cures Act, which has been hailed as one of the most comprehensive pieces of healthcare legislation since the Affordable Care Act. And we have done a lot since that. We have a better understanding of the human brain. We're making big strides in the fields of regenerative medicine. We've increased funding for Alzheimer's research. We've developed a new treatment for cystic fibrosis that actually cures a large percentage of the patients. And we've also seen a number of new generic drugs coming to market. We've seen enhanced data sharing among researchers at the NIH, and we've seen new funding opportunities for young scientists. We've funded some important research programs like the Cancer Moonshot, the Brain Initiative, and the Regenerative Medicine Innovation Project. But despite all of those successes, Fred and I decided we're not done yet. And so for the last 2 years, we've been working on legislation that we've been calling Cures 2.0 to build on the success we had with our first bill. The goal of the first Cures Act was to modernize how we develop treatments for patients. Cures 2.0 is focusing on how we deliver those new treatments to patients. So one thing the pandemic has really made clear to all of us is our federal agencies need to be better prepared for healthcare crises. And so there's a number of things in Cures 2.0. I know we'll discuss them today. One of them is to create a pandemic preparedness rare disease support program to give support to individuals with rare diseases and their families during future health crises. We're also looking at ways to modernize the CMS so that we can speed up their decision-making process on these wonderful cures that we're finding and that are authorized by the FDA. And then there's a number of other provisions in the bill around COVID-19. Something I know Fred's going to want to talk about is we're putting President Biden's DARPA-like program for healthcare into our bill, ARPA-H. And this is something that Fred and I have been working on with the White House for some months now. We worked on 21st Century Cures with then Vice President Biden to put the Cancer Moonshot Initiative into the bill. And now we're working on ARPA-H, which will help to expedite research into some of our thorniest medical issues. And so Fred and I are hoping that we can get even more support of this plan. And we have bipartisan, bicameral support in the Congress, as well as a real partner in the White House. And so, there's always more work to be done. That's the goal of Cures 2.0. Once again, I want to thank our two doctors who are with us on this panel, because they have been instrumental, and their colleagues have been instrumental in helping us really make these efforts something that will work to bring cures to patients. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my friend and compadre, Fred Upton.
Well, thank you, Diana. And let me just piggyback on some of your remarks, and then we'll start this discussion between some really world-renowned folks to get a better understanding of where we need to go. So everybody, we all do. We know somebody in their life that's been affected by a serious condition, whether it be Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, and obviously cancer. Now, I realized very early in my tenure, certainly as chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, that I was in a position to help work with the agencies under my jurisdiction to craft legislation to bring the system by which we discover and develop new treatments for these conditions into the 21st century. And thank God I had a partner like Diana DeGette. And between the two of us, it was pretty easy to really enlist some of the best minds here and leaders of our country, whether it be Speaker Ryan, Lamar Alexander, certainly Steny Hoyer, Nancy Pelosi, the leadership that we have, but the brilliant staff that we had, and obviously so many different support groups, many of which are participating today. We made it happen because of the bipartisan partnership that we forged, and we worked hard. We also had a very special focus on cancer. And I got to say that the Beau Biden Cancer Moonshot, and we met early on with then Vice President Biden, who was a great leader and helped for us. It was definitely one of the pillars in the bill that we helped pass and get enacted into law. It was one of the drivers that ultimately allowed it to pass with such a huge margin, 392 to 26 in the House. And I'd like to think that along with the other provisions of cures, it's contributed to some of the amazing advances that we've seen, not only in cancer therapies like gene therapy and CART, but many of the folks in this meeting certainly had a special hand in it. We also included language that ultimately led to the Oncology Center of Excellence within the FDA, headed by Dr. Pazdur, who's going to be with us. And I also want to think that as we embark on Cures 2.0, and we started nearly two years ago, it is going to build on these successes. And as far as goals, Cures 1 was about the discovery and development of new and innovative treatments. And while there'll be some of those elements certainly in Cures 2.0, as you've seen in the discussion draft that we've released, we have a focus this time on delivery, getting those treatments to the patients. That's where folks like yourselves come into play. Another thing that we want to do within Cures 2.0 is to find more and diverse populations to participate in clinical trials. In fact, we have a whole section of the bill that's devoted to diversity in clinical trials. And specifically, we're going to require an update from the FDA on efforts to improve diversity. And we're going to require HHS to utilize its multiple programs and communication channels to increase awareness and understanding of those trials. And I know from talking to the oncology community, that's something that's very important to this group for sure. Another thing we want to think about is important in the next iteration is to build on the work that we did in the first bill on RWE, or real world evidence. Fostering the development and utilization of real world data and real world evidence was a major priority in 21st Century Cures. And to date, RWE has mainly been utilized within FDA to improve safety and study of approved drugs, support label extensions of approved drugs. We're encouraged by their efforts, but we also believe that RWE holds additional promise across other federal agencies. And to speed up that promise, we propose several policies, including requiring HHS to outline approaches to maximize and expand the use of RWE, establish a task force, develop recommendations on ways to encourage patients to engage in real-world data generation, and allow the use of RWE to fulfill post-approval study requirements to confirm the predicted clinical benefit of a therapy with respect to the accelerated approval. Finally, the provision that everybody has been focused on is ARPA-H, and I would commend reading the story in yesterday's Wall Street Journal written by Michael Milken. COVID is the 21st century Sputnik. This is going to focus on very risky, but possibly game-changing health research. Like DARPA, this entity is going to be focused on producing research on things that may be too risky for the private sector and would move at a much faster pace than the current structure. There may be a high failure rate, but successes would have the potential to absolutely be groundbreaking. And our teams are working with the White House together on language right now that's going to set the parameters for exactly what that would look like. And to close, I just want to indicate that the House is going to include money funding for this new ARPA-H within the Labor-H budget, and we'll see that move forward. Again, it's going to be what I consider to be what will be President Biden's one of his legacy efforts to get this thing done. So with that, we're ready to begin. And unlike us taking a lot of questions, Diana and I are going to be asking the questions of our distinguished panel. And with that, I'll turn it back to my partner, Diana DeGette.
Well, thank you so much, Fred. And your discussion of real world evidence really leads to my first question for our panelists. And that is, with COVID-19, we really saw the longstanding challenges in research and clinical care magnified and exacerbated. And so I'm wondering if you can tell us, either one or both of you, in what ways have clinical trials changed to address the unique challenges posed by the pandemic? And how do you think that this is going to affect our future clinical trial infrastructure? What can we push for novel and innovative clinical trial design to accelerate cancer research in particular?
Sure. Maybe I'll start with that. Thank you, Representatives DeGette and Upton, for inviting me here to speak and for your strong support of the NIH and the FDA, and also for the really profound leadership in cancer research with the Cancer Moonshot and 21st Century Cures. It's a real pleasure to be here today. COVID has been a significant challenge for the nation in terms of cancer care and cancer research. We've seen, millions of screening events missed. We've seen cancer surgeries delayed and postponed. We've seen chemotherapy postponed. The clinics have been closed. Doctors haven't been open for business. It's been a tremendous challenge. It has also affected the cancer research enterprise very significantly. So we've seen a drop in accrual to clinical trials. And as you know, clinical trials are how we make progress for patients. And those provide the data that then allow us to approve new therapies for patients. And, that drop in accrual has been very concerning as well. We did learn some important things from COVID, though. We nimbly changed some of the ways that we do clinical trials at the National Cancer Institute. And we work closely with the FDA on these changes. So we allowed things like you could mail the drugs to the patients rather than requiring them to go to a hospital, pick them up, or we could do consent by telephone rather than requiring an in-person visit. So a number of changes to trials, and we've allowed trials across state lines in some instances that were difficult in the past. So those changes have been really important, and they're very popular. The patients and the clinical trial doctors have liked these flexibilities and want to see those things going forward. So what we're trying to do now is really kind of pick up the pieces from the pandemic and reinvigorate cancer care and try and make up these missed screenings and collectively do all we can to make up for the delayed diagnosis and potentially worse outcomes we're going to see in some patients because of the pandemic, but also learn from the pandemic in terms of clinical trials and use some of these flexibilities going forward to make sure that we continue to improve this area for future research.
I'd just like to echo on some of the comments Ned has made. Long before the pandemic, we at the FDA were talking about decentralized trials and looking at ways of really bringing clinical trials into the community. And the pandemic really forced our hand on this, so to speak. So some of the initiatives that Ned had mentioned, the remote informed consent, getting drugs mailed to patients' homes, remote visits, not having to go to a university center or a major cancer center to get routine labs and clinical visits are something that I think are here to stay. So I think one of the real lightning rods of the COVID pandemic was kind of a kick in the pants, basically, to the clinical trials community to really answer the patient's needs here, and that is to have these innovations kind of permanently in the clinical trials apparatus. And this is something that we're really looking forward to. And really, we have to bring industry along with this, and also our other regulators, international regulators on this too, because it's not just a US issue. We have to have a consensus with our colleagues worldwide, and we'll be addressing, I think, some of those issues later on in this discussion. But one of the things that Fred brought up that I think is very interesting that we heard is when this pandemic broke out, we took a concerted effort really to start talking on a weekly basis or a escalated basis to the patient groups and individual patients with cancer, because many of the patients felt abandoned basically in this pandemic. And I think as we look at other pandemics that may be coming in the future, that we recognize a need to have a catchment area really here to support other patients with chronic diseases that are life-threatening and provide them the adequate support while the nation is addressing the pandemic at hand. Because here again, one of the resounding notes that we heard from cancer patients during this pandemic was this feeling, everything's COVID, 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 and I have cancer and nobody's talking about me. And we heard that loud and clear, and therefore stepped up our efforts at the Oncology Center of Excellence really to provide that support.
Well, thank you, Richard and Ed. One of the issues that we saw with COVID, one of the critiques, particularly on getting people to be vaccinated, was the issue of people of color were perhaps not as part of some of those trials to the same shares as they should have been, very much like the debate. Back in the 90s, studying breast cancer, and it's at least the perception was that more men were studied than women. And so one of the issues that we're trying to address is that the clinical trials, in fact, provide important data to evaluate the safety and efficacy of new therapies and inform on the drug label, but it's critical that a diverse population representative of the population intended to receive the drug, once on the market, is included in its appropriate fair share in the clinical trials. What mechanisms and strategies would you might suggest to us that could help enhance diversity and address these disparities as we move forward?
I'll jump in, and then Ned, if you want to follow up. We just published a paper in JAMA Oncology asking for a diversity plan for the pharmaceutical industries that are going to be submitting and discussing their development with the FDA. And I'll refer the audience to that JAMA Oncology article, which I think really highlights the agency's interest in pursuing really the plans and discussion. This cannot be an afterthought as it has been, okay? It has to be prospectively defined in the development plan. What efforts are made, analysis of the enrollment at specific time points, and then trying to encourage escalation of ethnic and racial minorities if certain goals are not met. But one of the other very important things that I have emphasized to companies and the development community has been that this cannot just be for the registration trial. our efforts at recruitment and really exploration of differences in various ethnic and racial minorities have to occur from the very first dose in a patient, okay, in the phase 1 studies. And we see this lacking in oncology, where we don't see racial diversity in these early studies. And really, these early studies provide the framework and the foundation, basically, for subsequent studies, and could early identify potential differences that need to be followed up in subsequent registration trials. So we really look at diversity, and it is a continuum in the clinical trial program rather than just focusing on the registration trial. Ned, thoughts?
Maybe let me add 2 things to say about this. It's a really hard problem. This is, we've been working on this for a long time, and making progress in this area is challenging, but it's also a really important problem. There are many, many good reasons why we need clinical trials accrual to be representative in terms of race, ethnicity, access to care, et cetera. And the NCI has been focused on this topic for really decades. And frankly, I think our data are good in this direction. We have, with real steadfast effort, improved our accrual of Hispanic populations very strongly and of African-American populations significantly. And our data are now in that regard much better than, say, the pharmaceutical industries, although we still have work to do ourselves. The secrets to the success at NCI, what we have done right in this regard, has been creating community oncology research programs that recruit patients where they live, making it much easier to participate in a clinical trial. If someone has to drive 4 hours and sit in traffic and pay for parking and take a day off from work, they're much less likely to go on a clinical trial. So making clinical trials fit the patients is really, really important part of underrepresented population accrual. And we're still thinking hard about other ways to further our efforts in these areas. We have a new sort of a center program to create some new centers that really to focus on learnings and other approaches in these areas to try and develop it. But I think it's an area where we have made some progress, but there's still a ways to go. And certainly across biomedical research in general, there's still a tremendous need for better accrual of underrepresented populations.
One concrete thing that can be done is really the encouragement of racial minorities into the profession of medical oncology, both as physicians, nurse practitioners, pharmacists, et cetera. And I really think if we really want to get a diverse population of patients, we really have to address this. And we have been very active within the Oncology Center of Excellence, really with recruitment of African-American and other racial and ethnic minority groups, not only to reviewer positions and entry-level positions, but also in leadership positions. And I think that that is very important. In addition to this, we have several programs that we've created thanks to, again, the Moonshot program and the creation of the Oncology Center of Excellence. A diversity program looking specifically at and coordinating our efforts in all of the oncology divisions to ensure the discussions with the companies and to prod them in this endeavor of enrolling a diverse population. And then also a community outreach program. We just recently held a Black Family Cancer Awareness Week, basically, to reach out to the community to have these discussions about clinical trials. And this was a large effort, again, initiated by the Oncology Center of Excellence, but a community outreach, not focused on, the corridor of the Northwest, but really reaching out into the country, going to various rural areas, urban areas that we generally don't go to. But I think the FDA has to have its footprint outside of the Silver Spring area if we really want to be effective.
Well, I guess I'm next. And one of the things Fred and I have been really proud of, which we worked on in Cures, but we've also worked on independently of that, is some of FDA's expedited pathways, which have really led to getting therapies to patients quickly and safely, particularly for diseases, some of the cancers that we don't have treatments or cures for yet. I'm wondering if you can both talk about the importance of these pathways, accelerated approval, breakthrough therapies. Are they working as they are intended to work? And are there areas that we can enhance or improve these mechanisms?
Well, I'll go first. And I'll ask the audience a question. Okay, I see there's like 800 people out there or something. Do you think accelerated approval is under attack? I do. Do you think that some of the critics of accelerated approval may provide a one-sided viewpoint? I do. Okay. And I'd like to address that area because we do get our critics here. And I'm not opposed to criticism. Let me be quite honest with people. Okay. I think there is room for improvement, but we really have to take a look at a comprehensive viewpoint of the accelerated approval program here. And we've had over 155 accelerated approvals over the past 20 years, but only about 10 of these indications have been removed from the market. So there's been only a minority of these drugs that actually have been removed to the market. 85% of these are in oncology. So the program has been predominantly used in oncology. And one could ask the question is why it hasn't been used in other therapeutic areas. But I think behind this number really is the need to take a look at a comprehensive picture, not just focus on the drugs that failed, basically. And I want to talk about failed drugs shortly. And that is the success of the program. Because if you only view things from one lens here of the problems with the program, you miss the entire big picture of what has happened here in oncology. And I just want to emphasize some of the very important drugs that have been approved years before their confirmatory studies have been completed. And these include drugs like Gleevec that really ushered in the whole era of targeted therapies, drugs like Velcade, daratumumab that transformed the face of multiple myeloma, drugs that provided other targeted therapies and transformed non-small cell lung cancer such as alectinib and osimertinib. Our most recent approval of pembrolizumab in triple negative breast cancer, opening a new novel pathway of therapy, both for the neoadjuvant, adjuvant, and treatment of disseminated disease, a huge unmet medical need. So we just can't concentrate on what's wrong with the program. We also really need to address what is going right with the program. Now, I've addressed this on multiple times, and people want to focus on the drugs that have failed. And I keep on saying a failed trial does not mean a failed drug. And I think that that is something important for people to understand, that there are many reasons why a drug can fail. The trial was not designed appropriately. It didn't enroll enough patients. They selected the wrong patient population. It should have been a marker positive population or a selected population. They chose the wrong endpoint to look at. And we really saw this dramatically in the era of PD-1 drugs, where we had unprecedented growth. In oncology, over the past 6 years, we saw 76 indications, in 6 years for these PD-1 therapies. And they have transformed the entire picture of medical oncology, and I'm sure Ned will agree with me. And 35 of these 76 have been accelerated approval. Some have failed their confirmatory trials, and other of the same class have succeeded. And it probably wasn't a difference of the drugs, it was just how they designed the trials. And this was dramatically seen in small cell lung cancer, where 2 drugs of these PD-1 classes were removed from the market because they were studied in a very refractory setting. However, 2 of the other same class of the drugs were studied in a first-line setting combined with chemotherapy and were approved and defined a new standard of care. So it wasn't that the drugs failed, basically, it's the clinical trials were not set up appropriately to really express their true benefit to the patient population. But I think that that is very important for people to see. When we approve a drug on a single-arm trial, we are not putting out a placebo. People have benefit from these drugs. If the response rate is 20%, I firmly believe that 20% of these patients are receiving benefit. And this brings us again to our critics who believe that the only benefit that patients have is an improvement in overall survival. And for a person such as me who has practiced medical oncology for 20 years before I came to the FDA, I recognize that there's many other endpoints that people recognize that designate benefit to them. Shrinkage of tumors, a dramatic reduction in the size of the tumor, is the way medical oncology is practiced. The delay of rapidly progressive disease is a benefit into itself, and we measure this by progression-free survival. So it's very important that we just don't define a very narrow criteria of what defines success. Now, Diane, to get at your question, can we improve this program? Yeah. And I think, yes, we can. And here again, some of the difficulties in removing drugs from the market when they don't meet their primary endpoint, or we believe that the standards of medicine have changed, or there are other drugs that fulfill an unmet medical need that have been approved during the interval between their accelerated approval and their confirmatory studies being completed. But I think the other avenue is more discussions with companies on a comprehensive drug development plan aimed at really looking at what are the confirmatory studies and the accelerated approval studies before the drug is even filed, rather than having these discussions during the process of the accelerated approval review of a particular application. I think it's very important for those out there that are listening to this broadcast that their voices be heard about the accelerated approval process, and we not be defined by our critics here. I think that is extremely important, that we have a big picture of what this initiative has provided to us. And those people that are unwilling to voice their support for this program may one day wake up with a much different regulatory environment, one that may be very ultra-orthodox in its regulatory approaches to the cancer patients and put a p-value above the needs of cancer patients.
Ned, maybe you can chime in here about how we can do that, how we can get that message out to people about how important this can be.
Yeah, I'll be very brief because I largely agree with everything Rick just said. And by the way, Andy von Eschenbach has a piece in Stat today on arguing this topic. Only two people have ever run the FDA and the NCI, and it's me and Andy, and we agree that accelerated approval is super, super important for cancer patients. I don't know anything about Alzheimer's disease. I won't comment on that, the thing that stirred this all up. But trust me, for cancer care, it has really been transformative. Rick and I are old enough to remember the bad old days when patients couldn't get access to drugs like Herceptin. Women literally chained themselves to, the Genentech campus or something to get access to that transformative therapy. And we don't want to go back to those periods where we have these active agents that we can't get to cancer patients in a timely manner because of regulatory hurdles. And so I think under Rick's leadership at the FDA, the FDA has really embraced expedited review for cancer drugs, and that has been very, very important. And I would not like to see that change. So I agree that the program should be looked at and perhaps could be improved in some ways, but I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that these advances are really paying off for cancer. Maybe to just make one point of emphasis on this, we annually look at national statistics related to cancer death. And as you know, cancer deaths have been declining in the United States for decades, but that pace has accelerated rather significantly the last few years. And it's driven by lots of things, but the NCI has shown that one of the main drivers of that has been the widespread dissemination of these very potent medicines for lung cancer that Rick talked about, many of which were made available to patients years earlier because of accelerated review.
And we need to make sure that we preserve all of our gold standards in this country with the expedited review, the safety and efficacy. And I think that's some of the debate we're having right now. But people need to remember that like you say, the lung cancer drugs, some of the other drugs have really, patients have benefited.
Well, the whole field of multiple myeloma, for example, when I started, there were two drugs, melphalan and prednisone, basically.
And they didn't work.
That was it, so to speak. And we've approved now 10 drugs, and the average life expectancy for a common hematological malignancy is now anywhere between 8 to 10 years, when prior it was about 2 years. And that is greatly due to the drugs that were approved under accelerated approval. Most of them, if not all of them, were approved on response rate or time to progression, not on overall survival. And the true benefit of these drugs about getting them out is to use them in earlier states of disease as well as in combinations and sequentially. And people are just focusing on the drug application, this little box here, and miss the entire picture of what the drug will mean once it's out there and further developed.
And why you need post-market review.
Correct.
Fred, over to you.
Oh. So quick thing, Ned, thanks for bringing up Andy Van Eschenbach. He was an instrumental piece for us as we worked on cures. And literally, I sat with him for hours as he went page by page through our bill HR 6 to make sure that we got it right. He made very constructive, thoughtful improvements as we got that bill to the finish line. Let me just follow up briefly to Diana's question. What's your vision for driving this innovation forward? And how important is it to have this new concept, this ARPA-H, within the confines of what we're looking to do?
Let me take that one, Rick. I think it's important to say the National Cancer Institute and the NIH in general do some things really well. Like we fund basic foundational science that's, decades of this science has led to all these great advances in cancer care that Rick has been talking about. But that was built on, predicated on years and years of discovery and hard work. And I think the NCI supports that really well. I think we also, do some kinds of clinical trials really, really well, as I spoke about our data minority accruals earlier. But there are other areas where they're challenging for us. That require kind of very nimble framework, ability to work with industry, novel authorities that we don't have in terms of contracting and weedy government stuff that kind of slows our process down. And I think a tool like ARPA-H, which is designed to kind of get around some of those problems and allow for very nimble research, could be highly, highly valuable to cancer research and biomedical research in general. And so one of the examples that Francis Collins has spoken about is sort of an ARPA-H type project is to work in the development of these blood tests that you could take at a very early stage in a healthy person to try and diagnose cancer. So you'd go into the doctor when you're, say, over 50, and you would get tested for 20 diseases perhaps at once. And if based on a simple blood test in a healthy person, we could identify cancer potentially earlier. That's a technology that's potentially transformative if it works, but it needs to be evaluated in a proper, well-designed trial with mortality as an endpoint. That would be very hard for industry to do on their own for reasons I won't go into, but it's complicated. That would be very hard for the NCI to do. We could do it, but it would take a very long time. But I think something like ARPA-H could sort of slot in that middle and bridge that public-private divide and really accelerate research profoundly. To me, it's very important, and I think this group knows better than any that like if you look at the National Cancer Act, we're in the 50th anniversary of the NCA. It gave some money to the NCI, and I'm sure that was important at the time and very much appreciated. But if you look, from my perspective, what the National Cancer Act did that was even more important were the authorities it gave the NCI. It created Frederick National Lab. It gave us the Great Cancer Center program. It gave us the SEER cancer database, the most important database of cancer statistics worldwide. And so the authorities were what were key. And I think 21st Century Cures also got that right. Some of these things like novel hiring authority for the FDA and RMAT designation and some of these things that were very important in that bill have really been very important. And I think ARPA-H needs that kind of thinking too. If it's just looks like the NIH and has no differences from the NIH, it'll be like the NIH. But if it has novel authorities to work with industry or to do work with the FDA or other parts of government in a more nimble manner, it could be highly, highly valuable and really transformative for cancer research. And as we know, represents the top domestic priority for this administration. And I think is just perhaps the thing we need to move along some areas of biomedical innovation right now.
I couldn't agree more with Ned. And one of the things that keeps me up at night is really the wastefulness sometimes that we see at the FDA in the clinical trial settings, for example. Each company doing their own clinical trials, not working together, not working with each other. How many PD-1 drugs do we need? How many duplicate clinical trials do we need? Driven primarily by competitive and economic concerns for the individual drug companies. So I would hope that this program would provide that leadership and try to cut across some of these barriers that we have, not only in the government, but also with the private sector and within the private sector, also to bring the parties together.
We tried to change that, particularly with the university research. That was a major initiative that Diana helped lead, that siloing and allow more communication and interface. So with that, I'll turn it back to Diana.
Well, Fred talked a little earlier about diversity in clinical trials, so important. And I'm happy, I know we're both happy to hear about the efforts that you all have made. I'm wondering about global coordination and what your agencies are doing around coordinating on cancer research globally.
Want me to start on that one? We have a program called Project Orbis that I'd like to talk about. It was now in its second year, and I think it's important for people to understand why we initiated this. We had for about the last 20 years, right after I came to the FDA, a program where we discussed ongoing applications with the EMA, the European Regulatory Authority, Swissmedic, Japan, and Australia, and other countries. And it became quite apparent to me that we got the licensing applications sometimes years before these other countries did. And it really caused some problems that we were way ahead of these countries, and it wasn't good for international trials, and it certainly wasn't good for their patients who needed these sometimes breakthrough therapies. So what Project Orbis did was to leverage our regulatory system here, where when a company is developing a drug, or not developing, but bringing a drug to the FDA, we ask them also to submit the application to Health Canada, Australia, Switzerland, now the UK, and Israel has joined. Brazil has also joined. And we look at these applications together. I want to emphasize to the American public, we do our entire application by ourselves. We are not reliant on these other organizations or these other countries to do these reviews. So our complete review is done by our review staff with the same quality and concerns that we have traditionally had. What we do is bring these other countries into the discussions at certain points so they could hear what our thoughts are, because we will take probably action on these applications long before these other countries do. But it's a way to provide a level, consistent care throughout the world in oncology for really important breakthrough therapy drugs. And I think that this has really been one of the highlights of the oncology program. It has been rapidly accepted by these other countries. Australia loves it. Canada is working very closely with it. Brazil, as I said, Israel has just joined us. The UK is joining us since they left the EU. And it's been a highly successful program in getting drugs out to the world where there have been a substantial delay.
Yeah, I think Project Orbis is a great program, and it's, I think, a way that we can show worldwide leadership, and I think the FDA should be congratulated for that innovative thinking. At the NCI, we believe global cancer research is tremendously important for lots of reasons. We feel like we have a moral responsibility to end cancer suffering worldwide, and the United States has an obligation to show leadership on this area, and certainly we're very proud of our work we do globally to try and address cancer suffering in every nation, including low and middle income countries. Additionally, we think we can learn a lot through global collaboration. There are things about cancer that are become more evident when you pool data from lots of different countries, or there's certain kinds of clinical trials that are easier to do in certain environments. So for lots and lots of reasons, global cooperation in research is really, really important with both low and middle income countries and high resource countries. Along these lines, by the way, we're working very hard on a summit and joint planning with the UK on cancer research. This was announced by President Biden and Prime Minister Johnson at the G7. And, I think there are a lot of great opportunities for increased collaboration between those two countries, not one of which is they want more access to Project Orbis, Rick, so spoiler alert. But I think that, it's a very exciting opportunity to think about what are the real challenges for our two nations and move forward on those in a cooperative manner.
Just to give you an idea of the size of our oncology programs compared to other countries, and thanks to you, Fred and Diana, for providing resources to the FDA for the Oncology Center of Excellence. We have about 100 medical oncologists that work in disease-specific teams. So we have a very high degree of sophistication. really that matches most of the university and major cancer centers in the United States. In contrast, most of these other countries, such as Canada, Australia, maybe have one or two people, and they're faced with the same workload that we have. So they really value our input and our suggestions. And likewise, our staff loves to have that international dialogue because we don't have all the answers, and people outside of the United States sometimes come up with things that we didn't think about. So it's really good to have this not only academic exchange, but also cultural exchange of kind of an international regulatory community.
Well, I think that's a really important point that you make about the level of depth to our ability to review clinical trials, to make either regular a review or expedited review, breakthrough therapies. And I don't think a lot of Americans understand how, I don't think a lot of Americans understand just how our system in the US really is the gold standard for the whole world. But I'll tell you who does understand it is Congress understands it, because on a bipartisan, bicameral basis, we really always do support funding for the FDA and of course the NIH for this very, very reason. We want to remain the gold standard. And I'll just say, and then I'll turn it back to Fred, but we saw with COVID how when we did Operation Warp Speed and we were able to do large clinical trials in this country that had racial diversity, gender diversity, everything that we needed. And then we were actually able to review the evidence and to do emergency use approval in a very short time. But then you saw other countries like China and Russia, rushing through these vaccines, which are now proving to be not nearly as efficacious. I won't comment as a layperson on the safety, but I just think that it really is important and remarkable that we recognize that leadership that we have and that we build upon that. Fred, over to you.
Well, you're right on making those points, Diana, and I would note that we would be many, many months after the emergency use authorization approvals of those drugs for the vaccine, had we not been able to get 21st century cures. In essence, the last bill that President Obama signed into law would have happened many months later had we not been able to get that bipartisan approach approved. I know we're running short on time, so the last question, and we need to be somewhat brief here, Richard and Ned. So what's the magic bullet here? Where do you see the greatest opportunity to make a lasting impact on oncology research and clinical care in terms of a message for us to make sure that we can move forward and ultimately get it to President Biden before the end of the year?
I'll say two quick ones. So I think, the new paradigm in oncology of these personalized approaches, tailoring the therapy to the patient, that's here, that's not going away, that's changed how we do care. And so implementing that now, that requires a new clinical trial structure and a new regulatory framework and a new way of thinking. But that's a challenge for us. We the NCI match trial, for example, has been one effort to address that. And then also, learning from every patient. We can't have every patient be on a clinical trial. So data aggregation and data sharing, a bunch of weedy, complicated issues, but it's really important. The NCI is really leading an important initiative here around childhood cancer. So the Childhood Cancer Data Initiative is trying to learn from every pediatric patient with cancer in the United States, so that we can make progress for those patients in the nimblest, fastest way possible without having to put everybody on a clinical trial. I think so data sharing and personalized medicine are the future of our field.
People may find this rather surprising for me to say this because I spent my entire career, 40 years in clinical trials. But I think the major thing, or one of the major things that we have to remember, is the role of basic science and basic science research and the funding of that. all of our clinical successes are all predicated upon the basic science that made these drugs possible, our understanding of targeting, our understanding of the immune system, and we can't forget that. You could have the best clinical trial system, but if you have bad drugs, it ain't going anywhere, okay? So you really have to have that basic understanding. And once you have that, the clinical trials, with the caveats that Ned mentioned as far as aggregating resources, et cetera, become much easier. It's much easier for us to approve a drug that has an 80% response rate versus one that has a 10% response rate. Amen.
Well, thank you both. This has been a very important hour, and I would just tell folks that are still on, Diana and I participated last week. There's a select committee on how do we reform the Congress? How do we make this place work better? The two of us were called in to testify and we spent nearly an hour. You can actually go back to my website, upton.house.gov. I have a kitchen table report. We put it on there, but she and I testified for nearly an hour about bipartisanship and the impact that it can have on people's real lives. And it was an important hour. This has been an important hour. And, just as we could not have done this without, the relationships that we developed, the expertise from our staffs, listening, we could not have done it without the Friends of Cancer Research. They played such an important part to make sure that we had Republican and Democratic co-sponsors, that they pushed us to the finish line, that they too would not give up without us getting the right answers. And so, Jeff, your leadership here, and Ellen and everybody else, we want to thank you. We're at it again. We're going to get 2.0 to the finish line. And just like we had that relationship with so many outsiders and interest groups pushing us forward, we're going to need that help again. So, Jeff, thanks for organizing this. And we'll turn the speaker's gavel back to you to conclude today's event. Thank you so much. And thanks, partner Diana, for your leadership here as we move forward again on the next phase.
Thank you and good morning. What a great discussion today, ranging from key topics related to accelerated approvals to enhancing clinical trials and many others critical to future success. I'd like to thank Representatives DeGette and Upton for leading today's listening session and for their and their team's work to advance the Cures 2.0 initiative. Thanks to Dr. Pazdur and Dr. Sharpless for sharing their expertise and ideas today. And thanks to all of you for joining the meeting. We hope that this discussion and those to come will help propel the Cures 2.0 process forward. Please keep an eye out for future Friends events, including a virtual meeting on September 20th, where our expert working groups will be examining a decade of experience with the Breakthrough Therapy designation and providing new ideas on how this program can be optimized into the future as well. Thanks for joining us today and take care.